First encounter with a human warship shakes the Galactic Council. The transmission cut out at 0342 station time, and nobody in the monitoring room said a word for 11 seconds. I know it was 11 seconds because I counted them. Old habit. When the universe does something you cannot explain, you count. You breathe. You give your brain a moment to catch up to your eyes. I had been a council diplomat for 23 years, and in that time I had learned that the worst thing you can do when something goes wrong is panic before you understand it. So I counted. 11 seconds. And then the last analyst in the room turned to look at me, and her expression told me that counting was not going to be enough this time. My name is Vethan. I hold a third-tier seat on the Galactic Council, which sounds impressive until you understand what third tier actually means. It means I handle the problems that first-tier and second-tier councilors find too small to bother with. Border disputes between minor species, tariff disagreements over trade lanes that nobody profitable uses anymore, diplomatic complaints from civilizations that joined the Council within the last century and still did not fully understand how slowly everything moves here. It is, by design, a quiet post. I had chosen it for that reason. I am not, by nature, a creature who enjoys excitement. What was on that screen was excitement. The wrong kind. The monitoring station at the edge of the Kepler frontier had been running its standard sweep when it picked up the contact. The sweep ran every 6 hours. Automatic, boring, the kind of task assigned to low-grade sensor arrays and junior technicians who spent most of their shift doing other things. The station had been operational for 40 years. In that time, it had flagged exactly 3 contacts worth reporting, and 2 of those turned out to be dense asteroid clusters moving in unusual patterns. The third had been a decommissioned Council freighter that had drifted off course. This was not an asteroid cluster. The last 5 frames of sensor data were frozen on the main display. I had asked the analyst to isolate them, to enhance them, to run every filtering algorithm they had available, because part of me was hoping that the image was corrupted, that the sensor array had malfunctioned, that there was some simple, mechanical explanation for what we were seeing that would allow me to file a maintenance report and go back to the tariff dispute I had been working on before the alarm came through. The image was not corrupted. Whatever was in those frames was real. It was enormous. It occupied a section of the sensor grid that, when I converted the coordinates to physical measurements, came out to just over 3 kilometers in length. 3 kilometers. I had traveled on Council vessels that long, not warships. Council vessels did not really have warships in the traditional sense, but diplomatic cruisers, survey platforms, long-range communications relays. 3 kilometers was a serious piece of engineering. 3 kilometers meant resources, time, expertise, and intent. The shape of it was what held my attention, not because it was beautiful, because it was not. Most spacecraft, across every species in the Council, share a certain visual logic. They are built around the practical requirements of propulsion, habitation, and navigation, and those requirements tend to produce shapes that are at least somewhat elegant, smooth lines, efficient profiles, things that look, even to an alien eye, like they belong moving through space. This did not look like that. It looked like something designed specifically not to care about elegance. It was angular in places that served no aerodynamic purpose, because of course, in the vacuum of space, aerodynamics are irrelevant, and the fact that its builders had leaned into that irrelevance rather than ignoring it said something. The protrusions along its spine were not antennas. The clusters along its flanks were not sensor pods. I was not a weapons analyst. I had never wanted to be. But I had been in enough briefings over 23 years to recognize the shape of a weapon, even when I was looking at a vessel made almost entirely of them. The hull markings were the part that stopped my counting. I had a good memory for visual identifiers. It was one of the reasons I had ended up in diplomacy. Council species used markings the way living creatures used body language, to communicate status, origin, purpose, warning. I had spent years learning to read them instinctively, the way you eventually learn to read a face. And the markings on that hull, even at sensor resolution, even frozen in a 5-frame fragment of data from a relay station that had gone silent immediately afterward, I recognized them. Terran. Human. I pulled up the Terran file on my console. It was thin. 1 page of active summary, with a secondary archive link that nobody had flagged as essential reading. 60 years of Council membership, and the file was thinner than the maintenance report I had been about to file on the Kepler station's sensor array. The summary said what any diplomat who had sat through a council orientation knew. Humanity had achieved interstellar travel approximately 60 years ago, had applied for council membership, had been assessed as a Class II civilization, pre-stellar military doctrine, no recorded warship construction, ground-based defense focus, and had been admitted to the council under provisional observation status. They had upgraded to full membership 18 years ago, without incident. Their diplomatic delegations were polite, punctual, and generally unremarkable. Their military file was almost entirely empty. I sat with that for a moment. 23 years in diplomacy, 11 seconds of counting, and a file that was thinner than it had any right to be, for a species that had apparently just parked 3 kilometers of angular, weapon-covered spacecraft at the edge of our monitored frontier. The analyst who had turned to look at me was named Petra Hollis. She was a junior data specialist, barely 2 years into her post, and she had the particular expression of someone who has just discovered that the universe is significantly larger and stranger than her training prepared her for. She was trying to compose herself. I recognized the effort because I was making the same one. The station went silent 11 seconds after the last frame was captured, she said. Not because I did not know this, because she needed to say something, and that was the thing she had. I know, I said. It hasn't resumed transmission. I know. She looked back at the screen. The shape in the sensor data looked back at us, patient and enormous, and utterly unconcerned with the fact that it had just ended the quietest shift either of us had ever worked. I reached for my console and opened a priority channel to the council chamber. I did not know yet what I was going to say. I knew the words would come, because they always did, because 23 years had taught me how to speak calmly about things that frightened me. But for one more moment I let myself sit with the image, the shape, the hull markings I recognized from a file that was far too thin, and I thought about the word that kept rising to the surface of my mind no matter how many times I pushed it back down. Prepared. Whatever that ship was, wherever it had come from, however long it had taken to build, it had been prepared. Carefully, quietly, without telling us. And the silence from the Kepler station suggested, with a certainty that my years of diplomatic training were struggling to soften, that we had been given no warning because the entity that built it had decided, for its own reasons, that we did not need one. I opened the channel. "This is Counselor Vethan," I said. "I need an emergency session. Full chamber, now." I did not say please. In 23 years, I had never opened a channel that way. Some situations reach past the courtesies and pull you straight into the truth of them, whether you are ready or not. This was one of those situations. And as the channel opened and voices began flooding in from the various wing offices and residential quarters where counselors had been going about their quiet, ordinary evenings, I looked one more time at the image on the screen. 3 kilometers of something humanity had built without telling anyone. I did not know yet whether to be frightened or grateful. What I knew, with a clarity that settled into my chest like a stone finding the bottom of a lake, was that the galaxy I had known for 23 years had just become a different galaxy. And somewhere out past the Kepler frontier, in the dark between the stars, something enormous and angular, and bristling with purpose was waiting to introduce itself. The chamber filled faster than I had ever seen it fill. That alone told me something. When senior counselors move quickly, when first-tier delegates abandon their evening routines without argument, when the translation arrays power up in under 4 minutes instead of the usual 12, you are not dealing with a situation anymore. You are dealing with an event. Events have momentum of their own. Events do not wait for you to finish your previous thoughts before they demand your full attention. Counselor Dreth, first-tier delegate for the Vreth Combine, was already seated when I entered. He was a large creature, quadrupedal, with the deep gray coloring of his senior rank, and he wore the expression that I associated with him in difficult sessions, a tight, controlled arrangement of his facial muscles that communicated authority while concealing whatever he was actually feeling. He had been doing this for 40 years longer than I had. If he was disturbed, he had already buried it somewhere the rest of us could not reach. The Shalkir representative, a willowy being named Ish, was standing at the edge of the chamber floor rather than sitting, which was unusual. The Shalkir sat during formal sessions as a matter of protocol. The fact that Ish was standing suggested she had arrived too quickly to remember the protocol, or had arrived with enough concern that the protocol did not feel relevant. I noted this. Diplomats read rooms the way navigators read star charts, not because every detail matters, but because any detail might. My assistant, a young human named Owen Clark, was already at my station when I reached it. Owen had been with me for 3 years. He was efficient, careful, and had an unusual talent for appearing calm in situations where calm was difficult to manufacture. He was not appearing calm now. He was appearing like someone who was trying very hard to appear calm, and not quite managing the distance between the two. He handed me a datapad as I sat down. "I pulled everything we have on Terran vessel construction," he said quietly, "and on their history." "How long did that take you?" "About 9 minutes." "Why so long?" He hesitated. "Because I kept stopping to reread things." I looked at the pad. He had flagged sections in the secondary archive, the one attached to the Terran file that nobody had marked as essential. I made a note to read those sections as soon as the session gave me a moment. The fact that Owen, who was human himself, and therefore presumably had some baseline familiarity with his own species, had needed to stop and reread things, did not settle me. Counselor Dreth called the session to order, with the same 3 tones that had opened council sessions for 800 years, and the room went quiet in that particular way, that rooms go quiet when everyone in them has the same question, and nobody is certain who should ask it first. "We have received a fragmented sensor transmission from the Kepler Frontier Monitoring Station," Dreth said. The station subsequently lost contact. The transmission contained imagery of an unidentified vessel. Hull markings have been authenticated as Terran. I am opening the floor for analysis and response. He did not editorialize. That was Dreth's discipline. He presented facts and let the room react. It was usually effective. The room reacted immediately. The Vreth Combine's secondary delegate, a younger member named Korath, spoke first, and spoke loudly, which was his habit. He suggested that the vessel was likely a rogue construction, something built by a Terran faction without council knowledge or sanction, and that the appropriate response was a formal diplomatic protest demanding explanation and immediate disclosure. He used the phrase treaty violation 4 times in 40 seconds, which was the rate at which Korath typically deployed legal language when he was worried. The higher the worry, the higher the frequency. The Shalkir representative Ish, still standing, offered a quieter but sharper observation, that a vessel of that size could not be constructed without significant industrial infrastructure, and that significant industrial infrastructure of that kind could not be concealed from council observation for any meaningful period of time unless the concealment had been deliberate, systematic, and very long-term. She paused after saying this and let the room absorb the weight of it. Nobody argued with her. The weight settled. Counselor Dreth looked at me. I was the session's designated mediator, which meant I was the one expected to find the path through the room's competing instincts towards something resembling a coordinated response. I straightened in my seat and reached for the formal address tone that 23 years had made as automatic as breathing. "Before we discuss response protocols," I said, "I want to put the sensor data on the main display and have our analysis team walk through what they have identified. I think we are at risk of arguing about what to do before we have agreed on what we are looking at." There were nods around the chamber. Agreement is easiest when you offer the room something it can pretend is not a delay. The sensor images went up. The analysis team, 3 specialists from the Council's technical division, led by a soft-spoken expert named Gareth Lane, began their presentation. Gareth was thorough. He was also clearly rattled, which he expressed by being even more thorough than usual, as if enough data points arranged neatly enough might eventually explain away the thing on the screen. They could not explain it away. They tried. They identified the propulsion signature as modified Terran design, familiar base technology, but substantially upgraded. They identified the structural composition as an alloy not currently registered in any Council material database. They identified 26 distinct external systems and were able to classify exactly 4 of them with confidence. The other 22 produced varying degrees of uncertainty ranging from probable function to no viable analog in existing Council records. When Gareth reached the 22nd unidentified system and paused to collect himself, the chamber was so quiet I could hear the environmental cycling units in the walls. "Our working assessment," he said carefully, "is that this vessel was designed primarily for direct engagement scenarios, not for patrol, Not for deterrence display, for engagement. Counselor Dreth asked him to clarify the distinction. Gareth chose his words with visible care. A vessel designed for deterrence is built to be seen, to communicate the cost of conflict before conflict begins. A vessel designed for engagement is built to be effective once conflict has started. The design choices in this vessel, the armor distribution, the apparent weapons geometry, the redundancy systems we can partially identify, they are not about being seen. They are about being effective. Another silence. Ish, the Shalkir delegate, finally sat down. Somehow this was more alarming than when she had been standing. I used the silence to open the secondary archive on my datapad. Owen had flagged a section titled Historical Military Development, Terran Species, with a note that read simply, "Read this before you say anything." I trusted Owen's judgment. I started reading. What I found did not proceed the way I expected historical military documents to proceed. I had read such documents for many species over the years. They typically described conflicts in terms of territory, resources, political ideology, comprehensible motivations that, even when the outcomes were terrible, could be traced back to recognizable needs. The Terran records were different, in a way that took me several paragraphs to identify. The difference was refinement. Across the span of their recorded history, humans had not simply engaged in conflict. They had studied it, systematically. They had developed entire fields of academic inquiry, dedicated to understanding how conflict worked, how it could be predicted, how it could be optimized. They had scholars who spent their lives on this, universities with departments devoted to it, libraries of texts, spanning thousands of years, exploring every dimension of organized confrontation between groups of their own kind. They had, in other words, not treated violence as a regrettable feature of their history. They had treated it as a discipline. The more I read, the more clearly I understood something that our council file had failed entirely to capture. Humanity had arrived at interstellar travel with 60,000 years of warfare behind them, not 60,000 years of occasional conflict, interrupted by long peace. 60,000 years during which every major advancement in their civilization, metallurgy, chemistry, engineering, computing, had been at least partially driven by the question of how to be more effective in a fight. They had emerged from this history still standing, still building, still expanding, and apparently, somewhere in the 60 years since joining the council, still studying. I set the datapad down. I looked at the image on the chamber display. I looked at Owen, who was watching me with the expression of someone who had been waiting for me to reach a specific conclusion, and was not sure whether to be relieved or sorry that I had reached it. "Where did they build it?" I asked him quietly. "We don't know. We don't have observation assets near their outer system territories." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because they were a Class 2 civilization. When we assessed them. We don't maintain deep observation of Class 2 territories. It's not protocol." I considered this. 60 years of peaceful council membership, a classification that meant no one looked too closely, a secondary archive file that everyone had access to, and no one had apparently read. And somewhere beyond our observation, quietly, without announcement, a civilization that had been refining the concept of conflict for 60,000 years had been building something. Korath was still speaking. He had moved on to demanding a formal Terran delegation be summoned to explain themselves. Dreth was asking quiet questions of the technical team. Ish was staring at the image with the focused, unreadable attention of someone calculating odds she did not like. I looked at the hull markings one more time. The Terran file had called them minor, primitive, Class 2. And we had believed it because it was convenient to believe. Because a galaxy with 300 species in various stages of development required a filing system, and filing systems required categories, and categories required that you stop looking once you had assigned one. We had stopped looking. I thought about what 60,000 years of studying how to fight effectively actually produced in a species that had survived all of it. I thought about the 22 systems on that hull that our best analysts could not classify. I thought about what kind of civilization builds a vessel and then chooses not to tell anyone. I thought about Gareth's word, effective, not a deterrent. Something else. Something built for the moment when deterrence had already failed, and what remained was the question of who was still standing when it was over. In 23 years of diplomacy, I had learned to read rooms. What I was reading now, in the tight silence of the council chamber, in the set of Isha's posture, and the speed of Korath's nervous speech, and the very controlled stillness of Councillor Dreth's ancient face, was a room full of beings who had just realized, simultaneously, that the universe they thought they understood had been quietly revised without their permission. And outside the Kepler frontier, patient and enormous and entirely silent, whatever humanity had built was still there, waiting, not with the agitation of something that needed resolution, with the stillness of something that already had it. Owen leaned toward me. "They've hailed us," he said. His voice was very steady. That steadiness cost him something. I could see what it cost him. The vessel. It's transmitting on a standard council diplomatic frequency. They're requesting to speak with a senior counselor. I looked at the image one last time. "Put it through to the main display," I said, "and tell the technical team to record everything." He nodded and moved to his console. I straightened in my seat. Around me, the chamber went quiet, in a different way than before. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of a held breath. The main display shifted, the sensor image of the hull faded, and in its place appeared a human face. A woman, middle-aged, with brown hair pulled back from her face, and the kind of steady, unhurried expression that, I would later understand, humanity reserved for moments they had planned for. She looked around the chamber with what appeared to be genuine interest. Then she looked directly at the primary camera, which meant she appeared to look directly at me, and she smiled. It was a warm smile.
Easy.
The smile of someone who was comfortable. "Hello," she said. "My name is Captain Nora Vane. I apologize for the delay in reaching out. We had some minor maneuvering to handle first." She paused. "I imagine you have some questions." I had approximately 400 questions. The one I chose was the simplest, because in my experience the simplest question is usually the one that reaches furthest. "Captain Vane," I said, "how long have you been out there?" She tilted her head slightly. Her smile did not change. "Long enough," she said, "to be polite about it." Behind me I heard someone in the chamber draw a slow breath. I heard Korath stop speaking mid-sentence. I heard the environmental units cycling in the walls. And I sat with those 4 words for a moment, turning them over, because they were not evasion. They were not threat. They were something more precise than either, an answer that contained, folded inside its simplicity, the full shape of everything we had failed to understand about the species sitting across from us in 3 kilometers of engineered silence. Long enough to be polite about it. I had 23 years in diplomacy, and I could not find a better response, so I did what the moment required. I opened my hands on the table in the council gesture of formal welcome and said, "Then perhaps you would be willing to start from the beginning." Nora Vane nodded once, like someone who had already rehearsed this, like someone who had been ready for this conversation for a very long time. "We would be happy to," she said. The chamber arranged itself around the incoming feed, with the particular efficiency that the Galactic Council achieved only when everyone present was equally unsure what was about to happen, and equally unwilling to be seen as unprepared for it. Screens angled. Translation arrays reached full capacity. Every senior analyst who could be summoned in under 8 minutes was summoned. My assistant Owen moved to the secondary data console behind my seat and began pulling reference files with the quiet speed of someone who had already decided that whatever came next was going to require information faster than he could comfortably gather it. Captain Nora Vane waited. That was the first thing I noticed about her. She waited without performing the wait. She did not drum her fingers or shift in her seat or look around with the polite impatience that most beings display when they are aware that others are making preparations on their behalf. She simply sat in the frame of the transmission with her hands folded on the surface in front of her, and she looked at the chamber the way someone looks at a place they have thought about visiting for a long time and are finally glad to see. Behind her I could make out a room. Control station, clearly. Curved consoles, multiple screens, the ambient motion of crew members moving with unhurried purpose in the background. The lighting was functional, not dramatic. The whole image had the texture of a place that was used regularly for what it was being used for now, not staged for the occasion. I introduced myself. Full diplomatic title, full council seat designation, the traditional formalities that in any other circumstance would have felt like the natural start of a conversation, And in this one, felt like I was handing someone a piece of paper while they held an ocean. Nora Vane listened to all of it with the same easy attention she had given the chamber since the feed opened, and when I finished, she inclined her head in the small, clean gesture of acknowledgement that I recognized from the handful of times I had met Terran diplomats in person. Precise, not elaborate. "Thank you, Counselor Vethan," she said. "We appreciate the Council's willingness to speak with us directly." Counselor Dreth, seated to my left, leaned toward his microphone. "Captain Vane, this Council requires, before any other discussion, a complete accounting of your vessel's origin, purpose, and authorization status. You are operating within monitored Council space, without prior registration or declaration. This is irregular at minimum and in violation of the Frontier Navigation Agreement at maximum." Nora Vane nodded. Not with the nod of someone conceding the point, with the nod of someone who had anticipated it. "Understood," she said. "I will address each of those points. But if the Council will allow it, I would prefer to share some context first, because I think context will make the accounting easier to understand, and I want the Council to understand us clearly." Dreth looked at me. I gave the small gesture that meant proceed. Dreth turned back to the screen. "You may proceed," he said. "Thank you." Nora folded her hands more deliberately on the surface and looked at the chamber. 41 years ago, humans became aware of something that we were not certain how to raise with the Council. We are not the oldest species in this body. We were, when we were admitted, among the youngest. We understood very clearly that our perspective on certain matters might not carry the weight we believed it deserved, and that bringing specific concerns to the Council, without adequate evidence, might cause us more problems than the concerns themselves. She paused, not for effect, but in the way of someone who chooses words carefully and needs a moment between ideas to make sure the next word is the right one. 41 years ago, she continued, our long-range observation assets the Council was not informed of, and I will address that directly in a moment, identified construction activity in 3 separate locations outside Council-designated space. Large-scale, systematic. The construction was not consistent with any civilian application we could identify. It was consistent with military fleet development. The chamber did not erupt. The chamber did the thing that highly experienced political bodies do when they receive information that changes the shape of every problem they thought they understood. It went very still, the kind of still that comes before a lot of very complicated things happen. Korath started to speak. Dreth raised one hand, and Korath stopped. I was grateful. "You will understand," Nora said, her voice remaining at the same calm, conversational level, "that this presented us with a choice. We could bring our observations to the Council, with the inherent risk that if the entities behind the construction had allied interests within the Council, our disclosure would cause more harm than good. We could do nothing, which was not something our nature permitted. Or we could gather enough information to be certain of what we were seeing, and develop a response that would be effective regardless of what the Council knew or did not know." She looked at me specifically then, not at the room, at me. "We chose the third option," she said. "We are aware that this choice carries significant implications for our Council standing, and for the trust relationship between humanity and this body. We are prepared to address all of those implications, but we wanted to be effective first, and now we are." I said the thing that the room needed someone to say, because if I did not say it, Korath would say it with considerably more volume and considerably less precision. "Captain Vane, I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You are telling this Council that 41 years ago, humanity identified what appeared to be unauthorized military construction by unknown parties, and rather than informing the Council, you spent 4 decades gathering intelligence and building a response capability of your own." "Yes," she said, simply, without decoration. "And that vessel behind your transmission is part of that response capability." "One part of it, yes." The chamber absorbed this. I watched faces around the room, and did what I had spent 23 years learning to do. I read them. What I read was not the outrage I had expected. It was something closer to the specific, complicated feeling that comes when you discover that someone solved a problem you did not know existed before you were even aware the problem was there. Ish spoke from her seat, her voice carrying the thin, precise quality the Shalkir used when they were asking a question they already suspected the answer to. "You said the construction was in 3 separate locations. Can you tell the Council who was building?" "Yes," Nora said. We can tell you who was building, where, current fleet status, and operational readiness estimates. We have been tracking all 3 programs continuously for the past 37 years. She reached off screen and returned with a small data device. I have prepared a full briefing package. We are ready to transmit it to the Council at your direction. Dreth's expression had not changed visibly in the last several minutes. That in itself was a kind of expression. Before we receive that transmission, he said, I want to return to something you said. You mentioned that your observation assets were not disclosed to the Council. Can you tell us the scope of those assets? Nora seemed to consider how to answer this. Not evasively, thoughtfully. The Council's assessment of Terran capabilities placed us in the Class 2 classification at the time of our membership application, she said. That classification was accurate, based on the information we provided. The information we provided was accurate as far as it went. She paused. It did not go very far. The room absorbed this as well. It took longer. You provided incomplete information to the Council during your membership assessment, Dreth said. We provided accurate information, Nora said, without flinching. We omitted information we judged to be sensitive. The distinction matters to us. It is unlikely to matter to the Vreth Combine's diplomatic office, Korath said sharply. That's probably true, Nora agreed. We are prepared for those conversations. She said it without heat, without apology, like someone who had already run those conversations in their mind many times and had decided they were manageable. I signaled Owen with a small hand motion and he leaned forward. I need whatever documentation we have on the Terran Scientific and Research Archive, I told him quietly. Specifically, anything related to long-range observation development, and I need it in the next 5 minutes. He moved, quickly and quietly. I turned back to the screen. Captain Vane, I said. Your vessel. Would you be willing to transmit a specifications overview to our technical division? She looked at me with something that might have been appreciation. We were planning to offer that as a courtesy, she said. Yes, we'll transmit the overview on the secondary channel. I will warn you in advance that some of the systems are difficult to contextualize without background, so we have prepared explanatory notes alongside the technical data. Gareth Lane, the technical lead, was already at his console. I gave him a nod, and he opened the secondary channel. What came through took 11 minutes to transmit, and approximately 40 seconds for the first reactions to begin. I watched the technical team as they read. Gareth was the easiest to watch because he had the kind of face that could not pretend things were fine when they were not. He had been in controlled distress since the session began, the quiet distress of a scientist confronting something outside the boundary of what he thought he knew. As the specifications came through, that distress changed character. It did not lessen, but it became a different thing, not the distress of confusion, but the distress of comprehension, the look of a person who now understood what they were looking at and was adjusting to the size of that understanding. 2 of the 3 specialists stood up from their stations at different points in the transmission, not dramatically, not urgently. They stood the way people stand when they need to move, because staying still has stopped being possible. The 3rd specialist, a young man named Callum Dre who was newer to the technical division than the others, and had always struck me as slightly more adaptable, read through the entire transmission without standing up. When it finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he looked at Gareth. Then he said, very quietly, the Point Defense Network alone. Gareth said, equally quietly, I know. The effective range on the primary rail system. I know. That is not a defensive range. I know, Gareth said again. That is not what it is for. I looked at the screen. Nora Vane was watching this exchange on the chamber feed with the same attentive, unhurried expression she had maintained throughout. She caught me looking and said, Our engineers would be happy to answer questions. We anticipated some of the systems might be unfamiliar. Some of them have no analog in our records at all, I said. That would be the ones we developed specifically for this program, she said. They don't have analogs because nothing we found in council records required us to solve the same problems, so we solved them independently. She paused. Our engineers find it useful to start from the practical problem and work backward. What do we need this to do? Then, how do we make it do that? The council's design approach tends to work in the other direction, from established technology forward. Different results. I thought about the 60,000 years of recorded conflict in the secondary archive that Owen had flagged. I thought about 60,000 years of practical problems and engineers working backward from what they needed something to do. And then I thought about what kinds of problems, repeated over 60,000 years, would eventually produce 22 systems that our entire technical division could not classify. Owen returned to my side. He placed a datapad face down on the surface in front of me, which was his signal that what was on it was significant enough that he thought I should decide when I was ready to see it, rather than having it presented to me without context. I left it face down. I would read it in a moment. "Captain Vane," I said, "you mentioned earlier that this vessel is one part of your response capability. Can you tell the Council what the rest of that capability looks like?" She looked at me steadily. "Yes," she said, "though I would suggest we move to a smaller setting for that part of the conversation. Not because we are withholding anything from the Council, but because a smaller room makes it easier to have the kind of conversation where everyone leaves understanding the same thing." Dreth asked the question that the room was already forming. "Are there other vessels in the vicinity?" "Yes," Nora said. "How many?" She considered for a moment, not hesitating, deciding how to say something precisely. "Enough," she said, "to make certain that the 3 construction programs we have been tracking for 41 years will take us seriously when we ask them to stop." The chamber was still again, that particular, complicated, adjusted stillness. "And if they don't stop?" Ish said. Nora Vane looked at the chamber. Her expression did not change. Her voice did not change. "That scenario has been planned for," she said, "extensively." I turned the datapad over. Owen's flagged note read, "Terran Military Doctrine, Core Principle, extracted from Historical Archive, original translation." Below it was a single line, 7 words. "Hope for the best, prepare for everything." I set the pad down. I looked at the display. I looked at Nora Vane, who was looking back with the patient, warm, entirely genuine expression of someone who had prepared for everything, and was now, finally, in the room where the beginning of the next chapter was going to be written. I said, "I think we should arrange that smaller meeting." She nodded. "We have coffee," she said. "Real coffee. We brought enough for the Council." Somewhere to my right, Korath made a sound. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the screen, on the woman sitting in front of 41 years of preparation, and I thought about how extraordinarily, specifically fortunate it was that the civilization that had done this preparing was one that had led with coffee. The coffee was, by all later accounts, excellent. The shuttle they sent for me was not what I expected. I had imagined something functional and austere, a transport craft stripped to its purpose, the way military vessels typically were when they bothered with small craft at all. What arrived at the Council docking ring was clean and precisely maintained, with interior seating designed clearly with multiple species in mind, which told me that whoever had planned this vessel had also planned for the possibility of guests. That level of forward thinking in the shuttle alone was enough to give me something to think about for the 15-minute crossing to the TSS Permanent Solution. My name, as it happens, means something in the old diplomatic register of my species that translates loosely into careful watcher. My family chose it for me before I showed any sign of whether it would fit. It fit. Over 23 years of watching carefully, I had developed a practiced skill at entering rooms and reading them before anyone in them had time to arrange themselves for a visitor. It was my most useful professional tool, and it had served me reliably in every negotiation I had ever walked into. It served me now in a way I had not anticipated. The moment the shuttle's door opened into the receiving bay of the TSS Permanent Solution, I began reading the room. And what the room told me was that I had come with the wrong set of expectations entirely. The bay was large. It could have accommodated 3 of the shuttle that had just brought me, with space to spare. It was occupied by approximately a dozen human crew members who were doing ordinary things, running a systems check on a secondary craft, reviewing something on a handheld display, moving equipment with the easy efficiency of people who did this routinely. None of them looked up with the stiff attention of a crew that had been ordered to make an impression. Several nodded when I stepped through. One raised a hand in greeting. A young woman who appeared to be the designated reception officer came toward me with the specific kind of welcoming expression that is neither performed nor overly familiar, just genuinely pleased. Her name was Lieutenant Diane Marsh. She was young for her role. with the kind of competence that in humans tends to show through their posture before it shows through anything they say. She welcomed me aboard, told me that Captain Vane was ready for me in the forward conference room, and offered to show me the route herself rather than providing directions. I accepted. We walked. This was not a short walk. The TSS Permanent Solution was 3 kilometers long, and while we were not traversing the full length, we covered enough of it that I had time to observe, and I observed everything. The corridors were wide enough for efficient movement, but not so wide they felt empty. The lighting was practical but not harsh. Every junction we passed through had clear directional markings, and at least 2 visible emergency system panels. The vessel had the texture of a place that had been designed to function well under stress, where stress had been anticipated as the normal operating condition rather than the exception. I saw crew members in 1s and 2s moving with the low-level purposefulness of people who had important things to do, and had organized themselves to do them without drama. I saw workspace areas through open hatches, technical stations, maintenance bays, at least one room that appeared to be a training facility where 3 people were working through a simulation I could not identify at the angle I was passing. I saw no idleness. I saw no tension either. The 2 things were separate. The crew of this vessel was relaxed and extremely busy simultaneously, which is the specific quality of a team that has been together long enough to trust each other without thinking about it. We reached the forward conference room. Nora Vane was there, as promised, along with 2 other officers she introduced as Commander Alistair Webb, her senior tactical officer, and Dr. Sylvia Grant, head of their intelligence division. A table, sized for the group, had on it exactly what Nora had promised: coffee, in proper cups, with a secondary arrangement of what appeared to be other Terran beverages for variety. I sat. Nora poured the coffee herself and placed it in front of me without ceremony. Then she sat, and Webb sat, and Sylvia Grant settled into her chair with the particular stillness of someone who listens for a living. "Thank you for coming," Nora said. "Thank you for the shuttle," I said. It was thoughtfully equipped. We weren't certain what a comfortable crossing looked like for your species, so we consulted the Council's own specifications from your standard diplomatic craft and matched them. Sylvia pulled the documentation. I looked at Sylvia Grant, who inclined her head. I noted this. Not because it was unexpected. It was entirely consistent with the prepare for everything doctrine that Owen had found, but because the specificity of it said something worth noting. They had not approximated comfort. They had researched it. They had found the actual standard and matched it deliberately. "I would like to address the Council's formal concerns," I said, "but I would like to hear your briefing on the 3 construction programs first. As you suggested, I think context will help." Nora nodded to Sylvia Grant, who opened a thin display on the table surface between us and brought up a series of images that I recognized immediately as deep space sensor data, high resolution, meticulously labeled, with timeline markers that began 41 years ago and continued in steady increments to within the last 6 months. What followed was an hour and 40 minutes of the most thorough intelligence briefing I had ever received on anything. Sylvia Grant spoke the way exceptionally skilled intelligence officers speak, with clarity, with precision, with a complete absence of editorializing that somehow made the content more alarming rather than less, because it meant that every alarming thing she said was the straightforward product of evidence and not the amplification of fear. 3 locations, 3 separate entities, all council members in good standing. The Vreth Combine, whose secondary delegate Korath had been loudly demanding accountability from the Terrans in the chamber not 3 hours ago. The Shalkir Meridian, whose representative Ish had sat very still during this entire session. And a third party, smaller, newer to the council, called the Dranath Sovereignty, whose name I recognized from a tariff dispute I had handled 4 years ago and had found entirely unremarkable. Each program had been under development for a period ranging from 31 to 41 years. Each was operating outside registered council space. Each had reached what Sylvia characterized as operational readiness, or close enough to it that the difference was a matter of final calibration rather than fundamental capability. She gave fleet composition numbers for each. She gave readiness assessments. She gave projected deployment timelines under several different scenario models. The scenario models were the part that made the table very quiet. "How did you acquire this intelligence without our observation assets detecting your methods?" I asked, when Sylvia reached a pause. "Carefully," she said, and almost smiled. "And over a very long time, the first assets we placed were passive, observation only, no active systems. They were designed to look like background radiation artifacts at standard scan frequencies. We had 40 years to refine the placement and the coverage. By the time we began developing active elements, the passive network was established enough to mask them. The Council's own observation network is among the most sophisticated in this region of space," I said. "It is," Sylvia agreed. "It is also designed around the assumption that you know where to look and what to look for. Our network was designed by people who knew that assumption in advance, and built specifically to exist outside it. I thought about 60,000 years of practical problem solving. I thought about what it meant to come from a species whose history had taught them, generation by generation, that security was not a thing you were granted, but a thing you built from scratch with your own hands, because no one else was going to build it for you." "Why are you telling us this now?" I asked. "You had 41 years in which you could have acted on this intelligence independently. You could have acted without involving the Council at all." Nora answered this one. She had been listening quietly while Sylvia presented, and when she spoke, it was with the directness of someone who had thought through what they were about to say many times, and had decided the simplest version was the most honest. "Because we are not interested in replacing one problem with another," she said. "If we act on this without the Council, we establish that humanity solves its problems unilaterally, outside the framework of the body we joined voluntarily 60 years ago. That is a precedent we do not want to set. We want the Council to work. We want this framework to have teeth. We went outside it once, to prepare for a scenario where we needed the capability to protect it. We are coming back inside it now because protecting it means involving it." I picked up the coffee. It was, in fact, excellent. I gave myself the moment of drinking it before I responded. "The Council will have significant concerns about the process by which you arrived here." "Yes," Nora said. "The incomplete disclosure during membership assessment, the unregistered observation assets, the undeclared military capability development. These are not small things." "No," Nora agreed. "They are not small things. And yet," I said carefully, "you are in possession of 41 years of intelligence on 3 separate programs being run by current Council members that amount to exactly what you were accused of: unauthorized military fleet construction outside declared parameters." "Yes," Nora said. "We are aware of the irony." I set the cup down. "What do you want from the Council, specifically?" Alistair Webb, who had not spoken since the introductions, leaned forward slightly. He was a lean, quiet man, with the unhurried manner of someone who had made peace with operating in conditions of sustained uncertainty. "Formally," he said, "we want an upgrade to Tier 1 status. The capability review that status would normally require will now be straightforward. We also want the 3 programs disclosed through official Council process and ordered to stand down." "And the intelligence you have gathered?" "We are transferring the full archive to the Council today, unconditionally. Everything we have, organized by program, timeline, and verification source. The Council can use it however it sees fit. And if the 3 parties involved refuse to stand down..." Webb looked at Nora. She looked at me. Outside the conference room windows, the TSS Permanent Solution had real observation windows in this section, which was an architectural choice that told me something. I could see the stars. "Then we will handle it," Nora said, "with or without the Council's formal authorization, though we would strongly prefer with. We brought enough assets to make the outcome not a matter of significant uncertainty." "How many ships?" I asked. She looked at me with that steady, warm expression. "Enough," she said. The same answer I gave the chamber. Enough to be certain. I thought about what Gareth Lane had said about a vessel designed for engagement rather than deterrence. I thought about the 22 unclassified systems on a hull that was itself only one part of a capability that had been built quietly over 40 years by a species that had spent 60,000 years developing the discipline of effectiveness. I thought about what kind of courage it took, or what kind of nature it required, to look at a galaxy full of species you had only recently met, identify a threat that none of them had noticed, spend 4 decades preparing a response entirely on your own, and then, when the preparation was complete and the capability was real, and you could very plausibly have proceeded without anyone's permission, choose to come back to the table and ask for it anyway. "The Council will have objections," I said. "Many, loudly expressed." We expected that, Nora said. Some of those objections will be from the parties you have just named as operating unauthorized programs. We expected that too, she said. And we expect that when the intelligence archive is presented, the nature of those objections will become very apparent, very quickly, which is its own kind of answer. I was quiet for a moment. Through the observation window, the stars were very still and very bright. I thought about the way the chamber had gone still when Sylvia's data first appeared. Not the still of shock anymore, the still of a room recalibrating everything it knew. Owen will want a copy of the coffee source before I leave, I said. Nora smiled. It reached her eyes fully, which was something the transmission had not quite captured. We'll send a full supply with the data package, she said. Consider it our contribution to productive council sessions. Captain Vane, I said, I am going to be very honest with you about something. Please, she said. When I opened that datapad in the chamber this morning, before your transmission came through, I read enough of your historical archive to understand that your species has been thinking about conflict longer and more systematically than any other species currently in the Council. And what I am thinking about right now, sitting across from you, is what it means that a species with that history and that capability decided that the right move was to walk back through the door and ask permission. She was quiet for a moment. Webb looked at the table. Sylvia Grant was very still. It means, Nora said finally, that we have also been thinking about what comes after the conflict, and we have decided we would rather build that with you than without you. She paused. That is not sentiment. It is a strategic conclusion we reached after a very long analysis. We are better with the Council intact than without it. So we are here to keep it intact. She picked up her own cup. One conversation at a time. I thought about that. I thought about what it felt like to discover that the most dangerous and prepared species in the room had already run the calculation on whether to keep the peace and come out on the side of yes. I thought about how, in 23 years of diplomacy, I had never once sat across from anyone who frightened me and felt, simultaneously, this profoundly relieved. One conversation at a time, I repeated. She raised her cup slightly. Not a toast, an acknowledgement. I raised mine. The formal council session reconvened at 08 o'clock station time, and the room it reconvened into was not the same room I had left the evening before. I do not mean that the chamber had changed. I mean that everyone sitting in it had, and rooms are ultimately made of the people in them, more than the walls around them. Councillor Dreth opened the session. His voice had the same controlled, practiced tone it always carried, but there was something underneath it now. Not fear exactly, because Dreth had been doing this long enough to have moved past fear into something more useful, but a specific kind of adjusted gravity. The gravity of a person who has slept on information that changed the shape of what they thought they knew, and has come out the other side of that sleep with a revised understanding of what is required of them. I had brought Owen's summary report with me. He had stayed up most of the night compiling it, which I had not asked him to do, but which he had done anyway, because he was Owen, and because the situation had that quality of urgency that makes sleep feel beside the point. The summary contained 3 sections: the full intelligence package from the Terran briefing, organized for council presentation, a preliminary analysis of the implications for existing council security doctrine, and a short addendum that Owen had written himself, without my request, titled simply, "What This Means for How We Understood Them." That last section was 4 paragraphs. They were the most honest 4 paragraphs in the document. The morning session began with the formal presentation of the Terran Intelligence Archive. Sylvia Grant, joining the chamber via secure transmission, presented it herself. She was systematic, clear, and thorough, and she did not soften anything. The 3 programs, the scale, the timeline, the readiness assessments, the evidence trails that had been accumulated over 41 years of quiet, patient, meticulous observation. The chamber was quiet throughout the presentation, in the way that chambers sometimes go quiet when they are hearing something they already suspected was true, but had not had confirmed. The silence was not surprise. It was something harder to name, the particular discomfort of people who now had to do something with knowledge they had possessed without knowing it, in the shape of a silence they had chosen not to examine too carefully. When the Vreth Combine's representative Korath attempted to object during the second hour of presentation, He made it approximately 45 seconds before Dreth stopped him. Not with a gesture, as was usual. With a direct word. This was uncommon enough that Korath sat back without continuation, which told me everything I needed to know about how Dreth had processed the previous evening. The Shalkir delegate Ish said nothing at all from the opening of the session until midway through the afternoon, at which point she requested the floor and made a statement of 7 sentences that was, in its compressed precision, more complete than anything else said in the chamber that day. She said that the Shalkir Meridian's participation in the construction program Sylvia had identified was the result of a decision made by a previous leadership configuration and did not represent current policy. She said that the Meridian was prepared to immediately halt all activity, submit to council inspection, and engage in full disclosure. She said that the intelligence package presented by the Terran Division was accurate to the best of her knowledge. She said that she expected the same candor from the other parties named. She said that the Council's framework remained the appropriate body for resolving this matter, and she urged its primacy. She said that this situation had been allowed to develop because the Council had operated for too long on the assumption that membership implied alignment of intent, rather than verifying it through ongoing engagement, and she said that she would be submitting a formal resolution to revise observation protocols within the week. Then she sat down. The Drenith Sovereignty's delegate, a quiet being named Pell who had attended most sessions I could remember without ever saying more than 12 words in any one of them, now said 23. They were to the effect that the Sovereignty was fully prepared to cooperate. He did not look at anyone while he said them. He looked at the surface of the table in front of him. What he looked like was a person who had run a very precise calculation during the night and had arrived at the only answer that made sense. What he looked like was someone who had seen the specifications overview of the TSS permanent solution. Korath and the Vreth Combine held out for 3 more hours. This was not surprising. Korath's entire professional identity was constructed around a particular kind of bluster that functioned as armor. Bluster under sufficient pressure either hardens into something useful or dissolves, and for 3 hours it hardened. He argued process violations. He argued the impropriety of intelligence gathered without council authorization. He argued that the Vreth Combine's construction program was a sovereign security measure and not subject to external review. He argued with considerable energy and decreasing traction. It was Dreth who ended it, and the way he ended it said everything about the kind of counselor Dreth was. He did not argue with Korath. He did not present evidence at him, or cite treaty language, or construct a formal rebuttal. He waited until Korath had finished a particularly long and energetic statement, and then he said, very quietly, Korath, we have all read the specifications. Please consider what cooperation costs you compared to what it costs the alternative. Korath was quiet for 11 seconds. I counted them because it seemed appropriate. Then he said that the Combine would cooperate fully. The formal vote on Terran Tier 1 status came in the late afternoon. The chamber voted 94-3, with 1 abstention. Korath, to his credit, voted in favor. It was the correct calculation and he made it, which was the thing that made him, at bottom, a reasonable person despite his noise. I recorded the vote in my session log, and then sat for a moment with the record before closing it. 94 votes for a species that had joined this body 60 years ago, with a 1-page file and a Class 2 designation. 94 votes from beings who, 24 hours earlier, had not known that humanity had spent 4 decades building a capability in quiet that could have rewritten the shape of this region of space, and had instead brought it, complete and functional, to a table, and asked what was needed. Nora Vane's transmission was open again on the secondary display beside my station. She had been available throughout the day's session for questions, though very few had been directed at her after the morning briefing. Most of the session had involved the Council working out its relationship with information, rather than working it out with the Terrans, which was appropriate. The Terrans had said what they needed to say. The rest was internal. When the vote was recorded, and Dreth moved the session toward formal close, I looked at the secondary display. Nora was looking at the chamber with the same attentive, unhurried expression that had been there from the beginning. I opened a direct channel. The vote has been recorded, I said. Tier 1 status, effective immediately. Thank you, Counselor, she said. I want to ask you something that is not on the formal agenda. Of course. 41 years, I said. That is a long time to wait. It is, she agreed. Was there ever a point where you considered not bringing it to the council? Not asking for authorization? Simply acting? She was quiet for a moment. Through the observation window of the conference room where she was sitting, which I could see in the background of the transmission, the stars were in a different alignment than they had been the previous evening. Slightly, the ship had moved. Yes, she said, several times. The capability existed before the political decision to use it in coordination with the council, not instead of it. There were moments in that gap, when the capability was real, and the political decision had not yet been finalized, where the argument for simply moving was strong. She looked at me. We decided that the short-term efficiency of acting alone was not worth the long-term cost of being the species that acts alone. We want to be the species that acts within the framework, even when the framework is slow, even when the framework is complicated. Because we have spent a very long time learning what happens to frameworks that lose the participation of the entities capable of holding them up. I thought about 60,000 years of history, about what a species learns from living through the consequences of every kind of decision, over and over, across the full span of its existence. About what it means to arrive at interstellar space carrying all of that learning, all of that refined understanding of what works and what does not, and to decide, after calculating everything, that cooperation is not sentiment but strategy. The Council owes your species an apology, I said, for the classification, for the file we kept for 60 years, that was 1 page long. We understand why it happened, Nora said. We presented ourselves as Class 2. It served our purposes at the time. We also should have looked more carefully. She considered this. Yes, she said after a moment. You should have, but that is a lesson that belongs to the Council, and I think you have learned it. That is worth something. I thought about Isha's 7 sentences, about the resolution she was planning to file on observation protocols, about the way the chamber had gone quiet that morning, with the specific, sober quiet of an institution beginning to understand its own blind spots. Owen would like the recipe for the coffee blend, I said. He asked me to ask. Nora smiled. It was the same full smile as the previous evening, the kind that is not performed, but simply arrives. We will send him the full sourcing details. There are 3 regions on our eastern continent that produce beans worth recommending specifically. Sylvia has opinions. She will write them up. That is very thorough. It is coffee, Nora said, as if this explained everything. And perhaps it did. The same species that had spent 41 years mapping 3 unauthorized military programs in meticulous, patient detail had apparently also developed strongly held views on the regional variation of its morning beverage. You could not, I was beginning to understand, separate those 2 things. They came from the same root, an absolute seriousness about doing things properly, about understanding what you were dealing with before you drew a conclusion, about not accepting approximations when precision was available. Applied to warfare, it produced a vessel that our entire technical division could only partially classify. Applied to coffee, it produced a document Sylvia Grant was apparently already writing. The session formally closed. The chamber began its dispersal, the slow, careful movement of beings who had a great deal to do and were already beginning to organize themselves toward doing it. Ish passed my station on her way out and paused. The observation protocol resolution, she said. I expect it will require the support of multiple Tier 1 counselors to move quickly. I intend to ask yours. You have it, I said. She nodded once and moved on. She had the posture of someone who had accepted the weight of the day and was already thinking about tomorrow. I understood the feeling. I wrote my formal report that evening. I wrote it carefully, the way I wrote everything, because the record would outlast the moment, and the record mattered. I described the sequence of events. I described the intelligence presented. I described the vote and its margin, and the statements made on the floor. I described the formal terms accepted by all 3 construction program participants. I described the Tier 1 status vote and its immediate effect. And then, at the end of the formal section, I added a personal note. Council reports did not typically include personal notes, but mine sometimes did, when I felt that the factual record was not sufficient to capture the full shape of what had happened. I had done it perhaps a dozen times in 23 years. I did it now. I wrote, this council spent 60 years believing that a species was small because we chose a convenient category and did not look behind it. The species in question spent those same 60 years looking at everything including us. The lesson is not that we were wrong to trust new members. The lesson is that trust is not a substitute for attention, and a framework built on assumed alignment rather than verified engagement is a framework that has outsourced its own stability to chance. We were fortunate. The entity that exceeded our expectations exceeded them in the direction of the continued existence of this council, rather than its disruption. I had, somewhat unprofessionally, brought it back with me, because Owen had asked to see it, and because I had wanted to keep the reminder close for a little while longer. I drank the last of the coffee that was still in it, cold now, which was not how it was meant to be drunk, but which was, even cold, excellent. I thought about a species that had looked at a broken problem in a galaxy that did not notice it was broken, and had spent 41 years building the solution with their own hands, and had then chosen to walk back through the door and offer it to the room, rather than use it to remake the room on their own terms. I thought about what that choice said about them, not about their capability, which was documented and astonishing, about their judgment, about what they had decided, after all their history and all their preparation, actually mattered. They had decided that the framework mattered, that the slow, complicated, imperfect, bureaucratic framework of beings trying to share a galaxy mattered enough to be preserved even at the cost of the efficiency that abandoning it would have given them. In 23 years, I had sat across from a great many entities making a great many calculations. I had rarely been moved by any of them. The calculations of self-interest tend to produce predictable arithmetic, and predictable arithmetic is interesting to analyze but not to feel. What I felt, in my office in the quiet of the late station cycle, was something that took me several minutes to accurately name. It was the feeling of having been surprised by something in the direction of a better world. Not the world I had thought I understood that morning. A larger one. More complicated, certainly. Requiring more from all of us, definitely. But better. Genuinely better. Because somewhere in the dark between the stars, a species that had learned every hard lesson there was to learn about the cost of violence had looked at the galaxy they had just joined and decided that what it needed was not a new power to dominate it, but a capable friend to protect it. 41 years of quiet, patient, meticulous preparation, and then the choice, freely made, to come back through the door, with everything they had built, and set it on the table, and say, "We are here for the framework. We are here for the council. We are here for this." I closed my report. I placed the cup on the shelf beside my window, where the stars were turning slowly through the station's rotation cycle, and the galaxy was going about its vast and complicated business, revised and continuing. And I thought about Nora Vane's words, the ones that had been in my mind since she said them. We want to be the species that acts within the framework, even when the framework is slow, even when the framework is complicated, because we have spent a very long time learning what happens to frameworks that lose the participation of the entities capable of holding them up. I thought about that for a long time, and then I picked up my datapad and opened the preliminary draft of Isha's observation protocol resolution and started to work, because the framework did not hold itself up, and there was quite a lot left to do.